Hi everybody, this is Helle Bengt Jorgensen from Global Compact Network Canada. I should say good morning, good afternoon. We have people from all over Canada, and I was almost going to say all over the world, but at least also from Europe. I know it's just turned 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but I want to get started because we have 4 great panelists or speakers. We have a lot to cover, a lot of action. So let me just get started, and I know that there's a lot more people that will join, but I'm quite sure that that they have seen our first slide or two here. So let me just get started right away. Anna, I know you're sitting and helping me with the slides, so if you can take me to the next slide. Here we go. I'm very pleased to not hear any noise at the moment. We actually have hopefully muted you all, not the panelists. So I've asked the panelists to mute themselves while not speaking. You will, all of you that participated before in our webinars will know that you can ask a question by typing it into to the text box. We will, I very much hope, have time for Q&As. I'm sure there will be a lot. So actually also for that sake, we have now said that this is not just a 1 hour, but 1.5 hours. But let's dive into it. So Aparna, if you can take me to the next slide. Here you'll see our speakers, and I have decided, and thank you to those of you who said, please don't read the bios. We already have seen the bios online, and we all already know that it's great speakers that will be speaking at your webinars. So I will not read their bios, but here you can see that we have Lila Kabasi, who is from the UN Global Compact, Head of Environment and Climate Change. We have Elliot Mertzer from the Senior Associate for World Resource Institute Business Center. We have Paul out of UK, Investor Engagement Manager on environmental issues from UN PRI, so Principles for Responsible Investment. And last but absolutely not least, Canada, Jamie Bonham, who is the Manager of Extractives Research and Engagements from NEI Investments, and I believe, Jamie, you are now in Vancouver. And well, then you have me at last. So if we go to the next slide, Aparna, then we will see the agenda for today. So the introductions is what I'm doing right now. I have a few slides. Then Lila will be talking about the caring for climate and putting a price on climate. We will have Elliot speaking about Executive Guide to Carbon Pricing Leadership. We will have Paul speaking about carbon pricing from the investor perspective, and then Jamie in terms of also investor perspective, but carbon pricing engagement. Then the Q&A, and clearly if you have questions to the individual panelists, please do write as we go. And last, we will have a few slides, or 2 I believe, on our upcoming events as well. So with that, if we can take it to the next slide. See, those of you who were on our webinar last week where the Sustainable Development Goals were just adopted in New York, so I believe it was last Tuesday we had the webinar, while the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in New York the Friday before, so the 25th, would have seen this before. And the new set of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, they range from those that are critical to tackling poverty, health, food security, water, affecting natural resources, underpin the economy, the ecosystem, marine resources, etc., etc. And although climate action, you can see that as goal number 13, I would argue that climate change will impact many, if not all, of the other Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, you will be hearing much more from the Global Compact Network Canada in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals while we are rolling those out in Canada. But I just wanted to leave that you see all of these different goals that actually so much tied into to climate as well. And then the last slide from me on the next page is actually just to let you know in terms of Canada that I want to make sure that you're all aware of the launch of the Acting on Climate Change, Extending the Dialogue Among Canadians. The launch will take place tomorrow, October 8, from 10 to 12 for those of you who are here in Toronto. And the collection of text actually also have a contribution from the Global Compact Network Canada Environment Working Group. So tomorrow's participants in the lounge will get a brief introduction to the Sustainable Canada Dialogues from a panel that represent not all of the contributions, but a subset. So we have First Nations, we have energy, we have labor, climate policy, and also a call to action from a youth representatives. I know it's tomorrow, but those of you who have not already said that you are coming and participate, but have the time to do so, please let us know. I think it will be a great event and great contribution to action on climate in Canada. But let us know about that. However, without any further ado, let's get to actually our panel. And if we can go to the next slide, then I will let Lilla speak about caring for climate and putting a price on climate. Lilla,
great. Thanks a lot, Hele, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone in Canada and other parts of the world. First of all, big thanks to you, Hele, and the local network in Canada for organizing today's webinar. We're having similar types of webinars in many other countries. We just had one yesterday with the US network, and with a great participation, about 100 companies attended. We had similar calls also in China, in the Nordic region, in France, and in Brazil, and some upcoming ones in the UK and South Africa. So this is a very timely discussion, as there is actually quite a good momentum at the moment on the topic of carbon pricing, and about 8 weeks to go towards COP21. So what I can do in the next couple of minutes first is to look at the recent trends on the topic of carbon pricing, then talk about the work of the Global Compact on carbon pricing, and then finally about COP21 and carbon pricing. Last month, in September, there were quite a lot of reports that have been released, about 5 reports actually that we know, global reports on carbon pricing, that looked at experiences of governments and businesses in putting a price on carbon. So the World Bank, for instance, released the State and Trends report, confirming again that there are about 14 nations, 23 cities that are using, cities, states, and regions that are using a carbon price, and the number of schemes that have been put in place on carbon pricing around the world have actually doubled since 2012. So a huge momentum there. And today, the schemes that are existing on carbon pricing, they're worth about $50 billion US. There's also some initial trend and progress in terms of linking different markets with one another, and some good results so far. In terms of individual carbon markets or carbon pricing mechanisms in different countries, in terms of linking the different markets together, and some good results in terms of limiting carbon pollution and maintaining economic performance in those countries that have put these schemes in place. There's also quite a lot of momentum in terms of business engagement and business buy-in. We, as Caring for Climate, have released a guide called the Executive Guide to Carbon Pricing Leadership. We've done that in cooperation with WRI and some Caring for Climate partners, and you will hear more about the findings of the guide in a minute from Elliot at WRI. And this guide is now open for public consultation for about a month, and the final version will be released at COP21. On the screen right now, you can see the three leadership criteria on carbon pricing that we've put forward. So three aspects: setting an internal price high enough to materially affect your investment decisions and ultimately reduce greenhouse gas emissions; publicly advocate for carbon pricing policies that would lead to a price on carbon on the market; and number three, to communicate on progress over time in a public manner. To date, we have about 50 companies that have signed up to the three criteria. They're companies from diverse regions and very different sectors as well. And those companies report to us that they see carbon pricing as one of the most effective tools for them to reach their greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And by putting a price on carbon within their company or advocating for policies or responding to certain regulation in their country, then essentially carbon pricing for them is a tool to drive their investments in clean energy and to prioritize energy efficiency. We have one company in Canada that, as part of the 50 companies, has aligned with the leadership criteria, and we think that there is scope for many more companies in Canada to step forward and become what we call carbon pricing champion by supporting the three criteria. So this is an invitation today for all of you, all the companies on the call, to look into the criteria and consider whether you could extend your support, especially in the lead up to COP21. We will put quite a lot of emphasis on carbon pricing at COP21 in our activities in terms of Global Compact and Caring for Climate. For COP21 in general, there is a text agreement that has been published on Monday. This is the very preliminary draft of what the agreement for COP21 could look like. And from the outset, it was clear that carbon pricing would not be part of this text agreement. So there's no expectation that there would be any provisions on carbon pricing, any kind of ruling in terms of how to account for emission reduction unit transfers from one market to the other. So the topic of carbon pricing is actually will actually not be reflected in the text agreement, and there's no expectation that it should be. However, outside of this text agreement, there are quite a few other deliverables that will count as the outcomes of the COP21 conference. In particular, many of the different countries are submitting their national contributions called INDC, and several of these INDCs do mention carbon pricing. For instance, China announced its commitment to a national emissions trading program in 2017, and this is following some of the pilot work that has been going on in the different provinces. There are also plans for carbon markets coming up in Brazil or a carbon tax in South Africa. So as part of the different national contributions, carbon pricing will be reflected. And carbon pricing will also be reflected in another aspect of COP21, which is considered part of the formal outcome of the conference, which is called the Action Agenda. And the Action Agenda is all actions, commitments, initiatives, actions that are taken by non-state, non-federal government, non-state actors. And this is where the Global Compact comes in, with our call for companies to come up on a voluntary basis and send their individual commitments for COP21 on climate, and also joining some of the collaborative platforms that exist already, such as the Business Leadership Criteria. All of that work will be featured in our event on the 7th and 8th of December in Paris, the 8th of December in particular, we have a 2-hour event, and that 2-hour event will constitute the official business event of the entire COP. And quite a lot of the 2 hours will be dedicated to discuss the topic of carbon pricing and also to recognize those companies that have aligned with the leadership criteria. So I think I will leave it at that, and we will hear quite a lot of insights and details also from Elliot at WRI. Thank you, Helle.
Well, thank you, Lila, and I heard your call for an invitation to companies in Canada loud and clear, and I think we have a lot of leaders here as well. So let's see what the next couple of months brings in that. Elliot, over to you.
All right, thank you, and thank you everyone for your attention today. And I'm going to do a bit of an open call here for your input after the webinar as well. So I expect many folks on the line have questions. Some may have direct experiences with carbon pricing. What we've been doing with the UN Global Compact and others over the past several months is collecting those experiences, hearing different views, perspectives, lessons learned, with the idea that you can create an executive guide essentially for and by companies who are leading on carbon pricing, so that others that are trying to understand what they could do to price carbon internally and advocate externally for policy, what they actually can contribute and how they can make the case internally, et cetera. So we've done about 15 or so interviews, got about 90 or so additional inputs from individuals by survey. And like I said, there's going to be an open call for input that I'll ask for all your great ideas and contributions to at the end of this. Next slide. So if you haven't noticed, except many of you already have, there's been a huge growth in attention, discussion, commitments around carbon pricing. Lila mentioned this. It's similar, action that's happening across the globe. Obviously, Canada's got some experience over the past several years, but the companies that are taking action, striking to see the growth. And the CDP report has some of this outlined over the last couple of years. But you've essentially seen a tripling over the last year. And the real striking number to me are the 580 or so companies that say that we're not pricing carbon now, but we're interested to price carbon sometime within the next 2 years. We're working on it. And we talked to a lot of those companies as part of this research and understood their challenges in creating a process or understanding what makes sense for them to price carbon. And there's quite a bit we've learned, and I want to share a little bit of that here. If you go to the next slide, I'll start to get into that. Before I do, I want to make sure that when you hear the term carbon pricing, we're thinking of this and talking about this in the same way. And we've seen that's not always the case. A lot of times people talk past one another and may say carbon pricing but mean something different than what the person across the table might be thinking. In the policy context, if you're talking about government actions to price carbon, oftentimes you're talking about something like a carbon tax or an emissions trading system, which are their own sort of unique conversations. If you talk about carbon pricing in the corporate context as a strategic, tactical approach to maybe meeting greenhouse gases or preparing for compliance obligations or just managing climate risks, you're talking about different types of carbon pricing. Could be a shadow price, where you're putting an investment criteria on future investments where it might be high emissions or low emissions, and trying to determine what is the best approach for the company to take. Internal taxes and fees. There's a lot of companies that are out there that are actually collecting internal funds for energy efficiency projects, renewable energy projects. Very different approach than shadow pricing. And then there's still others that have an implicit price. Maybe they haven't set a price up front, but nonetheless they're investing quite a bit of money into greenhouse gas reductions, and you can back out a carbon price that way. So all of those are examples of carbon pricing. But again, you could be talking about one or more of these things, and somebody else could have something very different in mind. So definitions are important here. That's one of the first things we learned in this process. Next slide, please. So we've organized the executive guide in its draft form now, and it's online. I'll share the link at the end here, in 3 parts. One, very basic, to get your board, your CEOs, your leadership aware of, comfortable with the terminology, the stats, explaining why they're hearing more and more about carbon pricing. And then the second part of the guide is really getting into the details behind those leadership criteria that Leela outlined. What does it mean to price carbon internally? What does it mean to advocate externally? And what type of reporting would be expected of companies? Not a full implementation guide by any means. I think that's a necessary step, subsequent phase of this. But first, just kind of understanding what is required of a leader at a very basic level, and finally getting some stories from others. This is, I think, one of the more valuable contributions this guide will make, is showing different approaches, outlining different steps companies have taken, and maybe connecting the dots between those who have already stepped out there, maybe have been pricing carbon for a number of years already, and can share their valuable lessons with others. Next slide, please. So one thing we learned, again, fairly early on in the process, is that different sectors will have different interests. And one of the more interesting takeaways from the survey we did was, what are energy-intensive companies looking at versus others? And it was interesting because they don't seem to be as preoccupied with the cost of implementing a carbon pricing system, or necessarily on the policy, but they're very curious about the methodology. And they want to have a strong standard method for pricing carbon, making sure they're doing it the right way. And they're also interested in the innovation opportunities. What can they do to use carbon pricing to drive investments in new technologies? And that's sort of R&D support. Meanwhile, others, sort of a broader group of non-energy intensive companies, far more, I'd say, early stage and looking at the cost and the return on whether it makes sense to price carbon. A lot of these other ones, they don't have compliance obligations, so it might make sense that they wouldn't be as preoccupied with carbon pricing until recently. This is more of a value chain strategic conversation for a lot of these companies, and thus it's a little bit more early stages, I'd say. And I think there's something interesting here about how can one sector learn from another, and what does translate across sectors and what does not. So some indications here that sector-based approaches to carbon pricing might make sense. Next slide, please. And the other key differentiator, I'd say, is the approach and the objective that a company might take with carbon pricing. And I mentioned earlier, not all carbon pricing means the same thing. We asked companies in the survey, if you are pricing carbon, will you disclose your carbon price, and what exactly your objectives are with your carbon price. And it was interesting. There's a clear cutoff here between the blue and the red, and these are the prices they disclosed. And the blue are companies that are actually collecting the internal funds from a tax or a fee, and they're typically in the range of $5 to $15 per ton. And you imagine you're actually taxing different business units or operating units and having that, creating a central fund. So it makes sense that it wouldn't be as high. Now, meanwhile, you have these other companies that in the red that are using a shadow price, and they're probably doing so because they're preparing for compliance obligations. We did look at this to see if it was sector based. Interestingly enough, different sectors are represented in the blue and in the red. But it's interesting to see when you maybe look at the CDP report or elsewhere, and you're trying to compare prices, you're not necessarily comparing the same thing. It's very important you understand what that price is after. Is it preparing for future regulations, or is it collecting internal funds? And that's going to dictate where that price level lands. So just be, word of caution here on comparing prices and trying to set a price based on what others are doing. Make sure you have a clear sense of what the objectives are among those who are already doing this. Next slide, please. I'm going to actually, in the interest of time, not go through all these benefits and challenges, but just make the note that there were common successes and common failures among the companies we talked to. I'd encourage you all to go to the executive guide online and get into more details on this. But I'm going to come back to this in a minute. And in particular, one of these is pretty interesting, and it might be something to consider. Next slide, please. So these other top three lists, again, based on the interviews and the survey we did, based on experiences to date, a lot of companies are doing this, not surprisingly, because there's a lot more policy in different places where they operate in or have market interests. Some of them have customers that are driving them to do this, and some have investors that are asking questions. I think we'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute. Among the lessons learned, a couple things are very important to keep in mind. carbon pricing can be very complex very quickly, and the companies that have done a lot with this and have succeeded with carbon pricing programs internally have kept things relatively simple up front and really try and stick to a simple approach. Microsoft tells a good story, for example, around what they do, and there's some white papers they published online to get some more details there. It's also important to note that carbon pricing alone is not driving the behavior change. Usually there's some additional programs or initiatives or leadership within a company that are driving the actual behavior changes. It's a useful awareness tool, but don't have it be your end-all, be-all climate strategy. It's not meant to do that. It's a tool. And on that last point about how it can complement other initiatives, next slide, please. You'll see that the companies that have stepped up and demonstrated leadership on carbon pricing already, a lot of them are making other commitments. And carbon pricing is a tool to help them achieve other things like a science-based greenhouse gas reduction target. Likewise, if you have something around engagement on policy and you're pricing carbon, you have an additional credibility with policymakers when they ask, well, why are you telling me we need to price carbon? Are you pricing carbon? Your answer could be yes, and here's what we've learned. I can tell you that the World Resources Institute, we're not a major emitter by any means. We're a relatively small organization, but we've experimented internally with carbon pricing, had some successes, had some failures, to be honest, and we've learned quite a bit. So this learning by doing, I think, really does add quite a bit of value, and the way carbon pricing complements a lot of these other leadership commitments companies are being invited to, I think it's an important thing to recognize. Next slide, please. So this is where I'll wrap up and encourage everyone to get online. We've been using the online platform Collaborate, which if you're not familiar, as I wasn't, it's a very nice online tool where you can comment directly and read a document. You can see how others have commented too. This is a draft, and it's meant to be informed and strengthened by those who would be using it. So very much encourage you to get on, share your experiences. You can also get in touch with either myself or the folks of the Global Compact for more information. But it's an opportunity here over the next couple of weeks to share your questions, share your inputs, and then at the end of the process, we'll have a nice, strong draft to share into COP21 and afterwards. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Elliot. A lot of information to take in here, really good. And I love your comments in terms of learning from others, and that's exactly also what we do in our different action groups and working groups at the Global Compact Network Canada. So I'm quite sure that some of these groups will be taking this in and looking at that. Now I want to turn to the investor side, and Paul, one thing is that the Global Compact Network Canada and UN Global Compact as such focuses on the companies, but as I always say, we also have the investors, and that's the UNPRI. And so, does investors care about this? Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Helle. And I think the brief answer to that question is yes, but we'll talk about that in a bit more detail and hopefully give everyone a bit more context around why that is the case. So happy to be with you all today, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak and letting me add to the smorgasbord of accents we've got on the call today. I apologise for the background noise. We're just cleaning the office here in London already. It's 7:30 over here, so getting towards the end of the day. So first up, I want to introduce the PRI, and the PRI was formed in 2006 by the UN Secretary General, who invited a group of the world's largest institutional investors to set up an initiative to encourage responsible investment. The PRI now has, or has always had, in fact, 2 UN partners, specifically the UN Global Compact, our friends on the call today, and also UNEP Finance Initiative. We've grown from very few to over 1,380 signatories around the world who collectively represent $59 trillion in assets under management. Between them, that is around half of the world's institutional investment capital, so a significant force of global investors there. And in terms of what that means to be a signatory, basically signatories are committing to 6 principles which, as you can see on the slide, recognize the materiality of environmental, social, and corporate governance issues. They basically commit to incorporating ESG risks, environmental, social, governance risks, into their practices and investment processes. So, carbon pricing. That's what we're here to talk about today, and I'll keep it relatively brief. But broadly speaking, investors have a unique position on ESG risks. So most asset owners, such as pension funds, have a long-term interest in addressing sustainability issues like climate change. Climate change is a long-term and significant risk to investment portfolios, which are often invested for upwards of 20, 30, 40 years to match the payout periods of retirees as they go through their working life and into retirement. So we're talking very long-term, and obviously that makes climate change a very material risk. Investors are therefore very interested in tools and mechanisms which can help address that within the companies that they have shares in. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to try and duplicate the guide because I think that's already a fantastic resource, and Elliot's already gone into some of the detail there, which is great. But instead, I'm going to try and show you in broad and brief terms how investors are also aligned with this and looking at carbon pricing themselves. And Jamie, who will follow, will no doubt give a lot more insights into this from a Canadian perspective. If we can just jump back one slide, we'll talk about the 3 broad elements here of the link between investors and carbon pricing. So the first one is risk reduction, and this is probably one of the major ones for investors. Climate change is something that needs to be managed, as I've already said, and carbon pricing allows investors to be sure that companies that are owning, companies that have shareholdings in, are prepared for future carbon pricing costs. It allows investors a risk consideration framework so they can think about capital expenditure decisions that companies are making, and maximizing, or minimizing the impact of climate change on their portfolio. And carbon pricing also allows investors to value and incorporate carbon risk in their investment analysis. So that's the main element. The second element here is the flexibility, and here we're talking about the fact that carbon pricing, whichever internal method you use, is a relatively flexible mechanism. So companies who incorporate carbon pricing in some form can reduce emissions or decide how to reduce emissions most efficiently, either across the business or in certain activities, or by using things like offsets or whatever it might be. So it allows for strategy on emissions to be incorporated into a broader business strategy. And finally here, carbon pricing is around new investment opportunities, and both within a company and more externally across the entire economy through perhaps government carbon pricing. This can stimulate innovation in clean technology and low carbon growth, as I'm sure you all know. And that in turn brings about new investment opportunities which investors are broadly pleased with. So next up, to talk through just briefly how the investor view is aligned specifically with the business like leadership criteria on carbon pricing. So we've already talked about the internal pricing and how that's a risk reduction mechanism for companies, so I'll skip over that one. The second element is around public advocacy, and that's where we're talking about the alignment of, at least from an investor perspective, it's around the alignment of policy activity with a safe climate and with ensuring that climate change risks are reduced over the long term. Investors have, for example, recently signed a statement of investor expectations on corporate climate lobbying, which sets out clearly the view investors have on company policy engagement on climate change. And this aligns also with Caring for Climate's work plan on responsible corporate engagement and climate policy. The advocacy on carbon pricing specifically is something I see very much within that as being core to advocating for responsible policy on carbon pricing and also action by other companies. And finally here we've got communicate. And communicating is to investors is primarily through public reporting and through CDP. And this gives investors with transparency so they can understand, excuse me, sorry about that, so they can understand the degree of risk mitigation undertaken by companies and also use this data to feed into their investment analysis processes. I think it's worth noting here at this point in time that investors do use a lot of this information that you might not think they do. And oftentimes you might find yourself disclosing a lot of information and in your sustainability reports that you think maybe investors don't actually see this, no one really reads it. I would say that that is definitely not the case, and the feedback we hear constantly is that investors are really looking for more and more information about ESG risks and sustainability, and carbon pricing is no exception to that. Okay, so finally, just in terms of what investors are doing a lot of things on climate change, and there's a whole platform set up, in fact, to talk through that. It's called investorsonclimatechange.org, and you'll be able to see all the activities that investors are doing to address climate risks. One thing that I did want to touch upon in more detail is the Global Investor Statement on Climate Change, which was released in 2004. And one of the core elements here is investors around the world asking policymakers to put in place stable, reliable, and economically meaningful carbon pricing that helps redirect investment to measure it with the scale of the climate change challenge. So investors, by and large, from big to small, have all set out their own support for carbon pricing, and you can take that as further confidence that your organizations can do the same. I'll leave it at that and happily pass over to Jamie to give more detail.
Thanks so much, Paul. And I do have questions, but maybe we should wait a little bit with that and again get to Jamie. But everybody, if you have any questions, feel free to put that into the question box. And we'll get to them after Jamie's presentation here. So Jamie, over to you. And in terms of, well, now my question was, does anybody in the whole world care when we're talking about investors? But if we then look to Canada, what do you see in terms of Canada and putting a price on climate, or price on carbon?
Sure, absolutely. And I assume you can hear me, everything's okay? Yep.
Yes, it's fine.
Yes, great. Thank you. And there will be a lot of overlap with the previous presenters, which I think in a way is a good thing, since we are all on a similar page and finding out similar things. So just first, maybe a little brief something about NEI, just if you haven't heard of us. It'll help give you some context around what I'm talking about. Next, yep, there you go. So we are a Canadian mutual fund company, about $6 billion in assets under management. About 60% of our assets are governed by ESG principles. Ethical funds is the name brand of what you would buy. Oldest, we have our 30th anniversary coming up next year, and one of the largest SRIs in Canada. And so we do have an investing thesis around environmental, social, and governance practices that will provide better returns over the long term and also create value to all stakeholders. It's sort of a stakeholder theory of the firm, if you will, where the purpose of a firm is actually to create value for all stakeholders, not just shareholders. But shareholders will benefit from that approach. So next slide. And so we are definitely supportive of the business leadership criteria, and it actually aligns nicely with the work that we've been doing on our own on this front. So we do have engagement is a big part of our program here at NEI, and so it is a fundamental part of how we make our commitment to responsible investment real. And I would include engagement with both companies and with policymakers in that. So we do have two parallel tracks. On the one hand, engaging with the companies themselves on adopting internal carbon pricing systems, and that is to Elliot's point, that is both scenario planning as well and shadow pricing, as well as actual internal price on carbon, where it's actually generating internal revenues. And then at the same time, we are also engaging governments to enact carbon pricing, and while also engaging the companies we own to publicly support and advocate for a price on carbon. And on that last point, and I believe this actually showed up in Elliot's work as well, is we have found a definite correlation between the companies that we first started talking to about this and have been doing carbon pricing for a while now and have kind of somewhat worked out the kinks and had some time to sit with this concept of a price on carbon. They're also the ones that are publicly coming out in support of a price on carbon to governments, even oil sands companies, dare I say. And I think it's because they have the uncertainty around what does a price on carbon mean is gone for them. They've demystified it. And so I do think there is actually a very strong link between adopting internal pricing and sort of having a progressive role in publicly advocating for carbon policy. Next slide. So our initial focus in terms of engaging on this topic of adopting a price on carbon was the oil and gas industry. And we filed our first proposal on this in 2007, and so conversations around this probably started around 2005 in terms of specifically around shadow pricing and scenario planning. So not so much on the internal an internal carbon tax, if you will, but more on having a robust scenario planning process in place to sort of project what the impacts of carbon pricing are. One of the things the initial pushback on this was around this idea of the complexity of picking a price based around the uncertainty, especially in Canada, the uncertainty around policy environment, and what policy is going to come through, what will the actual impact be. Highly uncertain then, still fairly uncertain now, though getting more clear. And that was the initial pushback. I would, to a degree, say that was ultimately beside the point. And this speaks to, if you noticed, again in Elliot's slide, one of the big sort of parts of that pie of what business leaders have questions about when it talks about carbon pricing was around the method and the methodology. And that is a very, it's an oil and gas approach, I guess. There are a lot of engineers there, and they really want to figure these things out. But in the end, you can get lost in those numbers and the various ways that things can be spun or looked at. What really matters is actually having the price and seeing what the impacts are. So initially, the pushback was on just getting transparency on what kind of price is being used. And the reason why we thought this was important, aside from just knowing as investors that a certain price range is in use and that the company will be robust throughout all sort of price ranges, there's also a part of this is around company or governments have been a bit low to act on carbon pricing, largely worrying about the impacts on companies and company profits. And having the publicly available these price ranges that are not, that the company is saying are not going to be a material impact, or at least not destroy the value of the company, I think that actually provides a bit of a backbone for governments to enact real policies. I would say what the current challenges are around the pricing systems, because almost all of the major companies, at least in the oil and gas side, are definitely doing this and are understanding of that a price on carbon is coming if they're not already under it, and that they need to understand things better. I would say now that the challenge is actually we don't have a great visibility on what the actual impacts of the scenario analysis have been. Are they making a difference? Are certain projects being put on hold based on these scenario analyses? You get into start to talk about things like stranded assets, where you have to worry about those long-term carbon costs. That clarity is not there right now, and so I think that could improve. And now, for ourselves, we're shifting towards some of the demand-side industries and asking them about an internal price of carbon. In Canada, I'd actually say the mining industry has done quite well on this, but oddly enough, I haven't really talked to them about it, just because of other maybe more pressing issues with mining companies that we've focused on. We haven't really talked about this, but of the companies we do talk about, we've noticed it a lot in retail, and there are a few companies doing a lot around that. And one thing they're identifying is interesting is their supply chain is where a lot of the exposure is, and then that's going to be a challenge. Next slide. And so in terms of engaging with governments, I do think there's a very strong role for investors, as well as obviously companies, to engage governments on adopting a price on carbon. I think there's many, there's sort of a risk side of it, much like Paul talked about. He went over a lot of these. In terms of from a responsibility, I will note the fiduciary duty that we have as investors to our unit holders, to who we're representing, is that if climate change goes the way it currently is going, if it's unmitigated, the impacts will be felt far beyond just whether or not you hold an oil and gas firm. It will be broadly across the markets, and all indications are probably fairly negative. And so just from a pure fiduciary duty perspective, having a price on carbon as a key way to mitigate those risks, I think, is very germane to investors. But from the opportunity side, I would speak to the opportunities around diversification within industries that have previously been fairly heavy emitting. One of the challenges that often comes up in companies who are trying to do energy efficiency projects internally is the competing for capital internally, right? And so you have a very high return traditional business, say drilling an oil and gas well, for instance, versus maybe a lower return, though a more guaranteed return, I'd point out, on, say, an energy efficiency project. And so competing for that internal capital is difficult. Scenario pricing, I would say, can help that if it's high enough, can actually drive some of those decisions, but having the actual price on carbon as well obviously will help with that. Low carbon investments, from all reports, we are going to have to put a substantive amount into low carbon technologies, renewables, energy efficiency and such, and if we are to meet our goals, and that is a sizable investment opportunity that will be more real with more robust climate policy. In terms of identifying better companies, to say that, to Paul's point, we do already look at this information and make decisions on who we invest in based on how they're currently managing carbon. A price on carbon would just help us define better who is actually managing the company well, because we do think that managing your carbon emissions and your GHG profile is an indication of a well-managed company. And then just certainty. Investors need certainty to allocate capital correctly, and currently there is a definite lack of certainty around where things are going. And I'll just do a little analogy, because I am in Vancouver right now. I'm based in BC. And when we first heard about a carbon price coming in BC and carbon tax, there was a lot of concern. There's a specter of the massive impacts it would have on just citizens as well as companies. And while, I mean, the companies that are paying sizable carbon tax probably would say it's not nothing, but at the same time, it's become a non-issue in BC. There is really, once it actually came into play, there really hasn't been it hasn't been all that frightening. And so, and I relate that back to the certainty. Like, once you have some certainty around the price on carbon, you realize it's not actually going to destroy your business to have a price on carbon, and in many cases is going to be a net positive. So, and then my last point here around the open door of governments. We've submitted and been engaged in conversations in 3 different provinces this year, in BC, Alberta, and Ontario, who have all done a deep dive into what climate policy should look like in the province. And the receptivity to hearing from investors, and I would say the same to hearing from companies, it has never been this good in terms of they are eager to hear, they are eager to get your input, but they are also eager to, if you will, have the support to move on a robust policy. Knowing that investors want this is definitely helpful for their own messaging, for their own actions that they want to take. And we did our first submission on carbon policy. I think it's actually earlier than 2007. Our website doesn't go back before that, so that's what I put down. Next slide. Just end it with, and this is just an example. So this is a letter that we put together with our colleagues at Share, another Canadian-based. They provide investment engagement services, and we managed to gather 120 signatories, 4.6 trillion in assets under management, and it's essentially a letter that just asked the government of Alberta to put in a robust and credible climate policy, including a carbon price, which they already have, to be fair, but a more substantive one. And I'll just point out that we put this together more or less 3 weeks in August, during which time almost everyone was on vacation, and we still managed to get a very substantive signatory base to it. So I think investors are keen. They are very much on board with this concept of carbon pricing now. And I really don't have too much more to say. Hopefully there's some questions, and otherwise that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And yes, if there's any questions, please type them in. And as there are none right now, I have the chance to actually ask a question. And I think I'll start with on the company side. So Lila, Elliot. So if you think about a company, and if there is no regulation, then who in the company start the discussion on putting a price on climate or carbon, and what have you seen being the drivers? So is it is it the CFO? Is it the finance team? Is it the R&D? Is it the board? Is it the sustainability people? And what's their argument? Is that there will be regulation, or customers want it, or what? I don't know, Lila or Elliot, if one of you would take that one.
Okay, well, I'm sure Elliot has a lot of insights because we sent a survey to about 150 companies, and he interviewed about 30 executives on that. But our sense has been that this is an issue that has been brought to the attention of the boards of many companies, and very often the decision about adopting a price actually needs to take place at the board level. And we know of several instances of companies that have actually decided to not really to adopt a new internal price on carbon, but to align, for instance, with the leadership criteria recently, and they had very intense discussions at the board level for 2 to 3 hours on that, and the significance of that, and their alignment with the UN. And these are companies that in some cases, those companies already had all the elements in place so that they could say that they would completely support the leadership criteria. So it was just a matter of affiliation with a UN-led initiative. And in some other instances, companies did not have an internal price on carbon yet. And we know of several cases of board discussions that took place in the past year. Also, in some, because of this big momentum going on carbon pricing, and new companies that came up and decided that this would be an effective tool for them because they expect future regulation, because it's a tool that makes sense from an economic performance, a financial performance, from a risk management performance. because their competitors are also adopting these types of practices. So in the guide, there's quite a lot in terms of the business case for carbon pricing. So I would say it's mainly driven by the Sustainability Office and with a strong role from the boards of directors.
Yeah, and this is Elliot. Just to build on what Lila was saying, I think she's absolutely right. I mean, this is something that's getting up to the highest levels of companies, and oftentimes there is an internal champion or two that are looked at as the experts, right? And they're the ones charged with answering the questions from the CEO, from the board, and having the background ready in hand to explain, here are the advantages, here are the disadvantages of us being a leader on this. And I'll say that those individuals, they usually sit in the sustainability team, sometimes as a cross-functional group, but the ones that have had success are the ones that go immediately to their colleagues in the very influential parts of the business and say, hey, what does this mean to you guys? This is something that we need to prepare for. Will you support us as we bring this up the chain? I think it's an interesting approach, getting the buy-in of those that have the most power and influence within a company. Maybe it's the growth centers and the growth areas for that organization. I'll say one other thing on this point. It's a good question because every company is a little bit different, right? I think there's a lot of good examples you can draw inspiration from, that are out there already. But I definitely encourage whoever it is within the company who's looking at this, considering this, I'd say be creative with carbon pricing and make it fit for your company. Essentially, if you can see this as a tool, shape it in a way that it makes most sense. Use it to achieve the objectives that you may have already set for climate change, or raise ambition for that. The companies that we're talking to now, the ones that are most interesting, at least from where I sit, are the ones that see carbon pricing as an opportunity, and then they say, well, what if we did this, or what if we did that? Some are using it to adjust revenue targets or build new business models, and that's the really exciting stuff. So I'd encourage folks to be creative and not necessarily follow another step by step, but create your own path with this, learning from the experiences of others.
Thanks, Elliot. We have a question from Patrick de Rocky, if I pronounce it correctly. So this is actually a question for all of you. Here we go. So, have businesses begun to analyze climate risk in their supply chain? Firstly, for carbon pricing, are their suppliers adopting a price on carbon, and how will this affect the supply chain and their businesses? I don't know who of you would like to start on this one.
This is Elliot again. I can do just a real quick relay of two companies we spoke with. Now, we did all these interviews in confidence and sort of not for attribution, so I can't say the company's names, but one company has certainly looked at its supply chain, and it's found that it can do all it wants on its own operations, but the real impact, as Jamie alluded to, is in the supply chain. And so understanding what they can do to price carbon such that they can invest or co-invest with their suppliers in upstream emission reductions is something they're doing now. One of the more interesting stories we heard. And then another one's looking downstream in its supply chain and realizing that its customers have a compliance obligation or will soon have a compliance obligation. So can they bake a carbon price into the services they're selling to that sector? And maybe charge a premium for those services that will help them reduce their carbon impact and their carbon price as a result. So the two quick stories, both upstream and downstream in the supply chain, but absolutely an area ripe for some interesting approaches here.
And actually, before you asked Lila and others to answer as well, Patrick sent in a second that builds on this. So, saying there is an increasing risk of supply chains beyond disrupted due to climate-related weather events. For example, are companies planning for the increased risk of a typhoon shutting down a port in Thailand, or flooding interrupting trade out of a port in China, or in that regard, some of these 100 events, 100-year events that now is not 100-year events anymore. So companies also looking into that?
Sure. I mean, I'll jump in quickly, and I don't have much more to add than what Elliot said around the supply chain in terms of working to understand what the risks are within the supply chain, other than to note, at least on the retail side we've talked to, that has risen to the top as a clear challenge. But to, I guess, the second point, they've also identified, somewhat related, not so much about the supply chain, but just the distribution that they rely on, being large retailers moving goods across the country, and the actual physical risks that are involved in various weather events is front and center, I guess, in terms of their considerations. And my own sense, not being totally within these companies, is not everyone has a handle on this just yet, but it is certainly on the radar, I think. But I have yet to see a really robust explanation of how these risks are being mitigated.
Lila, do you want to jump in?
I mean, not a lot to add to what was said already. I think this is a very complicated question for companies that are managing that with very often very complex supply chain processes, and it's quite similar for carbon pricing than other, for instance, main climate actions that companies are taking. We've heard also that companies that are setting targets according to science, for instance, they also have a hard time to monitor scope 3 emissions and generally what comes through their supply chain. So I think this applies also in the context of carbon pricing, and so far I don't think we've come across one company that has a very robust system in terms of how to deal with carbon pricing in their supply chain.
Got you. And perhaps that can lead me to a question also on the investor side. And I've heard both Paul, you, and Jamie both mention the fiduciary duty. And actually, Lila, when you were saying board of directors, so with the UN Global Compact board program, this is clearly also something that we discuss when facilitating discussions with the board of directors. But I know that I was going to say, UN Global Compact and UNEP-FI and PRI just put out a report about the fiduciary duty in the 21st century. And just looking at the executive summary saying, failing to consider long-term investment value drivers, which includes environmental, social, and governance issues in investment practice, is a failure of fiduciary duty. And I heard from many that many believe that it might be a fail of fiduciary duty if you do. Is that a discussion that you're also hearing from the investor side, or is this just an old discussion and will soon disappear, and people will understand that this is actually not only material in a environmental, social, governance way, but actually also material for the businesses from also a financial point of view?
Oh, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I'm happy to jump in there. I think it's worth pointing out that the report we published along with UNEP-FI, the UNEP Inquiry, and the Global Compact is focused on asset owner fiduciary duty and how fiduciary duty, well, how ESG is a fiduciary duty and must be considered by asset owners in order to meet that fiduciary requirement. I mean, whether the same applies to companies and particularly to their boards is something we didn't look at specifically, but I mean, from my experience, I would argue that it is, as board members are there as stewards of investor capital over the long term as well, and they are there to represent their shareholders and represent their long-term interests and maximize value, reduce risks over the long term as well. And I think climate change is a key long-term ESG I mean, you summed it up well there, but Helle, in that this is really something that is quite a big development in the ESG sense for investors, and really we're already hearing really positive things about the way this is allowing investors, particularly in markets like the US, to really tackle the fiduciary duty issue, which has been seen as a limiting factor in the past by some investors, and you know they've had a sort of perspective on fiduciary duty which has limited their action, and you know guidance like this helps investors to overcome that and further strengthen their processes on ESG integration, and likewise on engagement. I don't know whether Jamie, you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that in terms of whether this is it is an ongoing discussion, I guess. My sense is that we are actually, if I can use the word tipping point, past the tipping point of being able to recognize that ESG risks, that sort of accounting for ESG risks in your investment is actually part of your fiduciary duty. It's not contrary to it. I think the initial pushback years ago around incorporating ESG into investment decisions and practices was that we'll lose money, and that's against our fiduciary duty. Those voices are few and far between now, I think. I think almost all the major influential bodies that look at investment are recognizing that actually ESG issues can be very material, and that your fiduciary duty is to acknowledge them. And so I think climate obviously fits right into that, and for some industries more than others. The only thing I would add to that is just from my own experience in engaging companies on these issues, is that companies themselves see these as material risks and would like investors to take it a bit more seriously as a material issue. And so I think they very much, there is no resistance from I would say, the corporate end of having ESG issues become material, in the sense that they feel that a lot of these issues don't get the play that they should, especially for the companies who are obviously leaders in various ESG areas. So yeah, and that's my perspective anyways.
Thanks. I'm seeing that we have people started dropping off, and might be because people say that this was 1 hour and we actually made it to 1.5 hours. And I don't have any more questions, beside one that I would like to ask all of you. And Lilla, you started by saying in the text for COP21 in Paris here in December, climate or carbon pricing is not in the text agreement. However, you're seeing that on China and other countries actually starting to include carbon pricing in regulation. So I wanted to ask you all, if you look 5 years ahead of time, do you believe that we in the biggest markets in the world actually will have a price on carbon? No, Lilla, if you want to start, and if you dare look into it.
Yeah, I think, well, it's very hard to predict what will happen in any ways. There's so many parameters that can change, some of these big policy questions on an international setting. But at this stage, I would think that everything is leading towards that, towards having more robust carbon pricing systems in place, systems that are linked with one another, and systems that deliver a higher price on carbon. It's hard to attach a figure to it, but anything between 50 to 120, let's say, dollars per ton. That's what's projected as being an effective price. UNEP is coming up with a report soon with their analysis of what a future price on carbon may look like, and it seems that this interesting report has gone through many reviews, because the finding there is that in order to be effective, the price needs to be much higher than this, even closer to the range of $200 a ton. But my personal view, I would think that within 5 years from now, there will be much more progress on that, and hopefully that would be done in a way that it doesn't undermine economic growth and supports development. And I think it's possible to do that.
Thanks. Elliot?
Yeah, only one quick thing to add there, and that is, looking into my crystal ball, which is no better than anyone else's. I'm sort of expecting that in a matter of time, we won't be hearing about carbon pricing anymore. It'll just be part of doing business, as will a lot of the stuff that we're talking about right now. So I expect it'll be part of a new business as usual. And I think the fears of carbon pricing that still exist among those who aren't real familiar with it, I think those will go away fairly quickly once the learning curve is scaled.
And we will have the externalities just being internalized. Paul?
Yeah, again, not much to add. I think Elliot and Lila have really summed up that issue quite well. I mean, it is very much inevitable that carbon pricing will become part of the norm, and hopefully be talked about a lot less because it's not necessary to talk about it. Whether that comes from action by companies and policymakers following suit, or action by investors even, and policymakers and companies following suit, or vice versa, is yet to be seen. And to bring in the Australian perspective here from my own personal experience, know that market quite well. Is, there's been a to and a coming and going of carbon pricing in Australia, unfortunately, which has undermined investor security and investor confidence in carbon pricing in Australia. But that's not to say that this is still not seen as the most economically efficient way to reduce emissions. So I think, despite the hiccups along the way, which was natural with any kind of major shift in economic and business thinking, I think this is an inevitable outcome over the next 5 years and beyond.
Thanks. Anything to add, Jamie?
Sure. I mean, I'll just give it this Canadian flavor in that we will now, once Ontario comes out, and they're anticipated to come out with their carbon pricing sometime before Paris, we'll have the 4 biggest provinces in Canada all having a carbon pricing system in place. And Canada hasn't necessarily had a supportive federal government on the issue of carbon pricing. And so I think if Canada can get there, then I do anticipate that it will be a broader uptake. And I think it will be, if not everywhere, then prevalent enough that it'll be an accepted part of business, price on carbon. And the only thing I would add is that I guess getting where we need to go is not going to happen on the back of a price of carbon alone. It is an effective tool and an important tool, but we shouldn't necessarily expect all the change to come purely from being able to price an externality into to properly account for carbon emissions. I think there's a whole lot of other policy initiatives that are going to get us there, and a price on carbon is going to be sort of the stool that those stand on. So it'll be very important. It won't do it alone, so we don't necessarily have to hope for excessively high price on carbon to drive that change. Hopefully we can get there through other initiatives.
Thank you all very much. I think I will leave the last 15 minutes to actually people going out there and take action. And I guess we all heard Lila inviting Canadian companies to join, and I will just copy that and say thank you all very much for joining us today. You have now 16 minutes to do that. I know.
Send me an email on that.
I think we have somebody that's not muted. Aparna just put up our coming up events, so you can see them here. Remember, tomorrow, those of you in Toronto, you can hear more about Canadian road towards Paris and the action from all the scholars and other parties in Canada. And otherwise, you will, of course, be hearing from us in our GCNC Connect, our newsletter, on more events to come. So for now, thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, and let's act on climate. Thank you all.
Thank you.